Qualified immunity protects our officers from lawsuits arising out of actions taken in their official capacities. Critics say qualified immunity protects officers who have broken a law from being held civilly accountable for their actions, while proponents say these protections are vital to ensure that officers are protected from frivolous claims. How should federal qualified immunity be addressed?
This is something very near and dear to my heart, because this goes back to why we need to have consistent standards in the first place. Part of the problem is we have 18,000 different standards, and if we talk about equal justice under the law, but we have so many different standards to look at, well, then there's no consistency there in the first place. We're talking about basic justice and equal access under the law. The issue of qualified immunity, I think, is a band-aid solution that does two massive injustices, and I've already alluded to some of them, but I think it merits repeating. The first massive injustice is that, as I said, as a society, we've made a terrible decision that we want law enforcement to not only be responsible to sacrifice their lives or put their lives on the line to protect us from violent criminals and dangerous acts, but we've also decided that in addition to that, we're going to wage a drug war and make addiction a criminal offense and ask law enforcement to put their lives on the line to address addiction. We've decided that on mental health issues, we want law enforcement to act. For example, Marcus Davis Peters, an African-American black man who was naked and having a mental health episode, was killed. We've decided that on school issues, we want law enforcement to address. This is simply unfair, because the second injustice that's done is a community that, our American community as a whole, who is suffering with mental health issues, who is suffering with addiction issues, needs trained professionals who can address mental health and can address addiction, and they're not getting that support. And so not only are we asking law enforcement to do things that we haven't given them the tools to do, we're asking society to be content without getting the support that they rightfully need and deserve. And so we concocted this issue of qualified immunity to protect law enforcement officers who mean well. But the end result is that the people who need support don't get the support they need. So my solution to this is one that is supported by many law enforcement agencies right here in Virginia, and that is that it's not even a question of qualified immunity. Let's hire professionals who are trained in mental health, who are trained in addiction, and when we get a 911 call for an addiction issue or for a mental health issue, send those professionals along with law enforcement. Let them take the lead and let law enforcement be the backup, because I can guarantee you, nobody ever claims or complains when a law enforcement officer stops a rape or a murder or a robbery, because that's what we know we trained them to do. The right solution is giving law enforcement the tools they need, stop burdening them with things that we haven't trained them for, and instead help them work in a way that society can get the support they need on the critical issues impacting and harming society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid. Congressman Wittman.
Sure, thank you. Qualified immunity is exceptionally important to our law enforcement community. It is this, pure and simple. If a law enforcement officer follows the policies, procedures, and protocols on the job and follows the law, they are protected against frivolous personal lawsuits. If you really want to support law enforcement, make sure they don't have to continue to look over their shoulder to worry about if they're going to be sued every day for the job they do in very, very difficult situations. Qualified immunity, I would argue, is not concocted. Qualified immunity is essential to protecting our law enforcement officers. And talking about all these other elements, law enforcement officers are trained to work in cooperation with community service boards, with mental health professionals. They are part of teams to go out and do these things. I would argue instead of what my opponent wants to do, and that is to redirect dollars from the police departments, which is defunding the police, I would argue that we actually need to have additional dollars so police officers can get additional training, can continue to build their skills to make sure they meet these challenges. I believe each and every one of you in this room is very capable of doing those things. I think, too, that taking resources away from you doesn't help you do the job in a very, very, very challenging environment. So I believe, in the end, that qualified immunity is critical, and that making sure, too, that we enhance dollars for training, we make sure, too, that we help you build relationships, not only with agencies in the community, but also what you all do a great job of, and that's community policing. Continue to build relationships in the community. If you want to increase effectiveness, do those things and dedicate resources for those things to happen.
Thank you, Congressman. The next question will come back to you, Congressman Wittman. Bills such as the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act would deschedule and decriminalize marijuana at the federal level. Advocates of this bill point towards a growing number of states legalizing and or decriminalizing marijuana, just as the Commonwealth of Virginia has. While critics point to this bill as the dangers of marijuana and worry about the reduction of federal drug assistance. Please discuss the pros and the cons of ending this federal marijuana prohibition.
Well, first of all, I am not in support of legalizing marijuana, and I have talked to folks across the Commonwealth, prosecutors, law enforcement, that have said, Rob, please do not legalize marijuana. Now, decriminalizing it and helping in programs to address substance abuse and addiction, yes. Let's make sure we get people help. There is a public health impact of marijuana. It is clear. I've worked as a public health official for years. It is clear that there's a public health connection. It is clear that the law enforcement community sees a number of issues with legalization of marijuana. In fact, I would argue if you go to some of the states and listen to the comments by law enforcement and prosecutors in those states, they will tell you the problems that it has created, the stresses that it's put on law enforcement. I can tell you, having talked to prosecutors across the state, to a person, they have said, Rob, do not allow the legalization of marijuana. Looking at decriminalizing it and making sure that we get folks the help for substance abuse, I think is key. Legalization, no.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Rashid?
Sure. Again, keeping on my theme of keeping this fact-based, my opponent accused me of wanting to defund the police. Again, misrepresenting my record because he's not willing to defend his own. I have gone against my own party. In February, when the Democrats wanted to cut police pay as a political stunt, I publicly and loudly condemned it. I said, absolutely not. We must make sure that our law enforcement officers are paid effectively. And I did so loudly against my own party's leadership because it was the right thing to do. Right now, in the middle of a pandemic, the HEROES Act, which would have funded police who are suffering along with every state and local government by giving $900 billion, my opponent refused to go against his party and decided, I'm going to vote against the HEROES Act, knowing full well it was going to devastate police departments around the country. So again, that is the record. I am here to support these basic human rights, even if it means going against my own party. And the same rules apply when we talk about decriminalization of marijuana and legalization of marijuana. First of all, from the decriminalization standpoint, again, my opponent's record is that he has voted against this by refusing to allow banks to work with clients who are in the marijuana industry. The states that have legalized marijuana, a couple of really interesting things have happened. They have raised billions in tax revenue, which they can reinvest into social welfare programs, including education, including addiction treatment. They've seen a plummeting rate of opioid addiction. That's a key component. That is the opioid addiction is devastating our communities, and those states that have engaged in legalization have seen a plummeting rate in opioid addiction. And then finally, this is a matter of criminal justice reform as well. Black and brown communities and white communities use marijuana at about the same rate, but black and brown communities are arrested at a rate of 6 and 9 times higher, creating an unjust system. This will level the playing field, get us more money for education, and combat the opioid epidemics.
Thank you, Mr. Rashid. Next question is back to you, sir. The 1033 program is a Department of Defense program which places surplus military equipment with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Critics argue this militarizes our law enforcement agencies, giving them the appearance of occupying forces, while advocates highlight the use of this equipment to keep officers and civilians safe during dangerous criminal and active shooter incidents. What, if any, action should Congress take to address the concerns with the 1033 program?
This is an extraordinarily important issue because it goes back to this conversation we're having about how do we make sure our streets are safe, how do we make sure that our communities are safe, and how do we make sure that our law enforcement is coming home safe and sound every single night. As a human rights lawyer, I've studied this in depth and read the scholarship. And I haven't read the liberal scholarship or the conservative scholarship, I read the scholarship. But I'm going to cite scholarship done by the Koch Institute. The Koch brothers, of course, are known conservative politicos, whatever term you want to apply. And they've studied this issue in detail, and a couple of really critical and meaningful data points have emerged from this. One, getting military-grade equipment into the hands of local police does not make them safer. It does not allow them to better protect themselves against people who want to do them harm. There's zero evidence on a national scale, on a state scale, on a local scale that it actually makes them safer. Two, it doesn't actually decrease crime. So there's no actual evidence that doing so makes communities safer, or that it prevents murder, or rape, or robbery, or any other form of horrific violent crime. But it does do something very devastating to our communities, and that is that it creates a wedge between law enforcement and the community. It decreases trust between law enforcement and the community. And that's something that we have seen consistently in urban, rural, and suburban communities around the country. But there's another really devastating impact of these as well. Because once you get this equipment, you have to maintain it. And some of these military-grade equipments cost $500,000, $800,000, $1 million a year to maintain. So if you're a fiscal conservative, like many of us are, and you want to make sure our tax dollars are being spent in the most efficient and effective way possible, then you should absolutely oppose getting expensive equipment that doesn't make you safer, that doesn't make the community safer, that doesn't make law enforcement safer, but creates not only more distrust, but an added expense that we simply don't need. Right now, our children are having difficulty getting basic internet access because we can't apparently afford broadband. Right now, our teachers are paid 48th in the country, and 3 jurisdictions of law enforcement jurisdictions right in the 1st district are being paid below the living wage. That's where the money should be going, not towards additional equipment that doesn't make us safer, that doesn't make law enforcement safer, that doesn't make our community safer, but does cost a lot of money we don't have, and does devastatingly create more distrust between police and the community. So I think we need to reallocate those resources towards education and towards actual salaries for police officers, not for something that doesn't actually make us safer.
Thank you, Mr. Rashid. Congressman Wittman.
Well, I disagree with my opponent. If you look at the 1033 program, he says that 1033 equipment does not make our law enforcement officer community safer. Body armor is included under the 1033 program. Does anybody here believe that body armor doesn't make you safer? Nobody. My opponent says he objects to you getting body armor under the 1033 program. He objects to you making the judgment about what your force needs to protect itself. Each of you is answerable to the community, and I think making sure that the equipment that you have at your avail should be your decision. And you are answerable to the people that have elected you, the people that have appointed you, to go back to them and say, okay, this is the reason I need this. And you can make, at the beginning, a determination about what the cost of that equipment is in relation to your priorities. I believe in each and every one of you in this room that you are in the best position to make the decision about what's best for your department, that what's best for your community, and you are going to be accountable to the people that have put you in office. Your deputies are going to be accountable to the community. Our police departments are accountable to the community. Instead of having a mandate from Washington and saying that 1033 equipment doesn't make you safer and says you can't get body armor, you can't get other elements that help you do your job, I would say, I believe in each and every one of you. I believe in your decision making. I believe in what happens at the local level. My faith is in you. My faith is not in that 90 square miles of fantasy land we call Washington.